Part 1: Sandy Hook Elementary School. Adam Lanza lived quietly in a large house on a calm street in Newtown, Connecticut. To neighbors, he was simply the silent young man who rarely made eye contact and almost never spoke. He walked alone, kept his head down, and disappeared back inside as quickly as possible. People noticed his absence more than his presence. Nothing about him suggested danger. Nothing suggested that his name would one day be associated with one of the darkest moments in modern American memory. From early childhood, Adam showed signs of deep social withdrawal. He was often described as intelligent and academically capable, yet profoundly uncomfortable around others. Noise overwhelmed him. Physical closeness caused visible distress. Unstructured environments left him anxious and unsettled. Group activities were avoided whenever possible. While other children formed friendships and social routines, Adam retreated inward, finding safety only in isolation. As he moved from elementary school into adolescence, that isolation hardened. Teachers observed his difficulty connecting with classmates and his resistance to participation. Over time, the distance between Adam and the outside world widened. He did not adapt. He withdrew. What appeared on the surface as shyness slowly became a complete separation from ordinary social life. The fracture deepened after his parents divorced. His father remarried and moved away, reducing contact to rare and distant exchanges. Adam remained with his mother, Nancy Lanza, who became the central figure in his life. She took on the role of caretaker, protector, and intermediary between Adam and the world he could not tolerate. She managed his routines, attempted to accommodate his sensitivities, and eventually chose to educate him at home. The intention was care. The outcome was further isolation. Homeschooling removed the last remaining threads connecting Adam to peers his own age. There were no classmates, no casual friendships, no unplanned interactions. His world became smaller and more controlled. Days passed without visitors. Years passed without meaningful social contact. His identity was no longer shaped by interaction, but by repetition and solitude. As Adam entered his late teenage years, his life lacked the milestones that usually mark the transition into adulthood. There was no job, no college enrollment, no visible path forward. He rarely left the house. He did not invite others inside. His time was consumed by solitary activities, particularly online spaces where he could remain anonymous and detached. Investigators later found that much of his attention was focused on violent media and detailed discussions of past mass attacks. He read obsessively. He collected information. He analyzed events not as tragedies, but as patterns. Timelines, locations, methods, and outcomes were studied with methodical precision. This was not casual curiosity. It was fixation. Inside the home, firearms were legally owned and stored by his mother. She was known in the community as friendly and sociable, someone who enjoyed target practice and outdoor activities. She believed she understood her son's limitations and struggles. Those close to the family later said she was trying to help him function in a world he found intolerable. What she did not see was how deeply detached he had become from reality itself. In the final months, Adam's behavior shifted further. Verbal communication with his mother nearly disappeared. Instead of speaking, he left written notes. Messages were short, functional, emotionless. He spent long hours alone, researching past incidents and refining his understanding of them. His inner world was sealed off completely. On the night before the event that would define his name forever, Adam conducted online searches related to previous attacks. He organized his thoughts and actions with chilling clarity. There were no recorded demands. No public statements. No explanation intended for others to understand. In the early hours of the following morning, while his mother slept, Adam acted. She did not have time to react. Afterward, he left the house, taking weapons and supplies, and drove to Sandy Hook Elementary School. It was a place associated with children, routine, and safety. That contrast would later haunt the nation. When he arrived, the school was beginning its normal day. Security measures had been updated, and doors were locked. He forced his way inside by damaging a glass entry point. The initial sounds were confusing to staff. Some believed something had fallen. Others thought a door had broken. By the time the reality became clear, it was already unfolding too fast to stop. Teachers reacted instinctively, guiding children into hiding places, turning off lights, and securing doors where possible. Emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. Law enforcement responded immediately. The timeline inside the building was brutally short. In less than 11 minutes, 20 children and 6 adult staff members lost their lives. Many were trying to protect others. Some were shielding children with their own bodies. Others were attempting to lead students to safety. As officers closed in, Adam ended his own life in an empty classroom. There was no confrontation. No explanation. Only silence at the center of devastation. The aftermath was chaos and disbelief. Parents rushed to the school, desperate for information. Some were reunited with their children in tears. Others waited as the worst news became unavoidable. The images spread across the world. Vigils formed in cities and towns far from Connecticut. Names and faces became symbols of loss. Investigators searched the Lanza home and recovered computers, journals, and digital records. They confirmed the extent of Adam's research into past attacks. They identified severe mental health challenges, but no clear trigger in the days immediately before the event. There was no manifesto. No statement of motive. Only evidence of long-term withdrawal and obsession. Public reaction was swift and divided. Some focused on access to firearms. Others on mental health care and early intervention. Many questioned how such extreme isolation could go unnoticed for so long. Nancy Lanza was criticized posthumously for keeping weapons accessible in a home where her son was clearly struggling, though those who knew her described a woman trying, unsuccessfully, to help someone she loved. Because Adam did not survive, there was no trial. No sentencing. No cross-examination. The legal system could not provide answers or closure. Instead, the nation was left with questions that remain unresolved. Sandy Hook became more than a location. It became a reference point in every conversation about safety, prevention, and responsibility. The original school building was later demolished. A new structure was built in its place, designed with security and remembrance in mind. When people reflect on Adam Lanza, they struggle to reconcile his silent existence with the scale of what followed. He left behind no explanation, only a pattern of isolation, fixation, and disconnection that grew unchecked. The tragedy forced uncomfortable conversations about how society recognizes risk, how it supports vulnerable individuals, and how easily warning signs can be missed when silence is mistaken for harmlessness. What do you think was the most overlooked moment in this story that could have changed everything? In the next part, we move to another quiet community where a different kind of silence led to consequences just as devastating. Part 2, Robb Elementary School. Salvador Ramos grew up on the margins of his own community. He spent most days alone, drifting between long hours in his room and brief, disconnected moments online. School attendance faded, then stopped entirely. Teachers lost track of him. Classmates remembered him only as the quiet boy who stopped showing up. There were no clear plans for work, no graduation path, no visible future taking shape. What remained was isolation reinforced by neglect. Home life offered little stability. Arguments were common. Relationships were strained. He moved between relatives, never fully settling. Those around him noticed mood swings, frustration, and anger, but interpreted them as typical teenage struggles rather than warning signs. Bullying at school left marks that did not fade. Comments about his appearance, his speech, and his social awkwardness followed him for years. Instead of confrontation, he withdrew. Instead of seeking help, he disappeared further into himself. As adulthood approached, access replaced barriers. Upon reaching legal age, he purchased firearms through lawful channels. The process raised no immediate alarms. Background checks revealed no criminal history and no formal mental health records that would prevent the sale. Shortly afterward, he shared images of the weapons online. The posts drew attention but contained no direct threats. Without explicit language signaling intent, there was no intervention. Silence again was mistaken for safety. Online conversations hinted at darkness. He spoke with strangers about anger, resentment, and fascination with previous attacks. The messages were vague, fragmented, and easy to dismiss. Family members noticed changes in behavior but assumed he was depressed or acting out. No report was filed. No authority was alerted. The gap between concern and action remained unclosed. On the morning of the event, a domestic argument escalated. Raised voices. Tension long buried surfaced without resolution. A family member was injured but survived, managing to call for help. Salvador left the house in a vehicle and drove toward Robb Elementary School, a place connected not to him but to the routine of a quiet town. A crash near the campus disrupted the approach but did not stop it. Witnesses later described confusion as he exited the vehicle and moved toward the school grounds. Security procedures existed, but implementation failed at a critical moment. A door that should have locked did not secure properly. That single malfunction created access. Entry required no force beyond walking inside. Within moments, confusion spread through hallways and classrooms. Teachers reacted instinctively, attempting to protect students by locking doors, turning off lights, and guiding children to safer spaces. Emergency calls began almost immediately. Law enforcement arrived quickly. Officers reached the building while the situation was still unfolding. What followed was not absence but hesitation. Reports indicate uncertainty over command, conflicting information, and a critical misclassification of the threat. The assumption formed that the situation had shifted from an active danger to a barricaded individual. That distinction mattered. It shaped decisions. It slowed movement. Inside classrooms, children and teachers waited. Some whispered into phones, calling emergency services again and again. Others stayed silent, hoping silence would keep them safe. Minutes stretched. The sound of movement outside did not bring relief. The presence of officers did not translate into immediate action. Time passed without resolution. 77 minutes became the defining measure of the event. Not because nothing happened, but because everything that mattered depended on those minutes. During that period, classrooms remained inaccessible. Individuals remained trapped. Fear persisted without clear communication. The delay would later dominate public attention, overshadowing nearly every other detail. Eventually, specialized units arrived and moved forward. The situation ended when Salvador Ramos was confronted and did not survive the encounter. The building fell silent. Only then did the scale of loss become clear. 19 children and 2 teachers had lost their lives. Families waiting outside received confirmation that would change them forever. The immediate aftermath was marked by shock and disbelief. Parents searched for answers. Officials struggled to provide explanations that made sense of the delay. Medical teams worked through the chaos. Media coverage intensified within hours, carrying the story far beyond Uvalde. What began as a local emergency became a national reckoning. Investigations followed at multiple levels. Local agencies faced scrutiny. State officials launched reviews. Federal authorities opened independent examinations of the response. Radio logs, body camera footage, and internal communications were analyzed line by line. The focus shifted from the individual who carried out the attack to the systems that failed to stop it sooner. Findings pointed to breakdowns in training, communication, and leadership. Officers were present but lacked clarity. Orders were delayed. Responsibility was fragmented. The concept of immediate intervention, emphasized in modern response protocols, was not followed as intended. Families of victims demanded accountability. Some pursued legal action. Others spoke publicly, sharing grief and anger in equal measure. The school itself became a symbol of unresolved trauma. Plans were made to close and eventually demolish the building. Memorials appeared across the town. Photographs, candles, and handwritten messages covered fences and sidewalks. The names of those lost were spoken repeatedly, ensuring they would not fade into statistics. National debate reignited with renewed intensity. Discussions returned to firearm access, background checks, and age requirements. Mental health support for youth re-entered the conversation. But the loudest questions centered on trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in protection. Trust in the promise that help would arrive when needed most. For many, the most painful realization was not how quickly violence occurred, but how slowly resolution followed. The presence of authority did not guarantee action. Training did not ensure execution. Protocols existed, yet uncertainty prevailed. The event forced a reconsideration of what readiness truly means. Uvalde continues to live with the consequences. The community mourns while navigating investigations that reopened wounds. Families honor memories through foundations and advocacy, transforming loss into demands for change. The names of the victims remain central, refusing to be overshadowed by procedural failures. Salvador Ramos left behind no explanation that could justify the harm caused. His actions reflected years of isolation, unresolved anger, and missed opportunities for intervention. Yet the broader story extends beyond him. It is a story about systems designed to protect, and the devastating impact when they do not function as expected. Which moment in this timeline do you believe altered the outcome the most? In the next part, the story shifts to a university campus where warning signs were documented, discussed, and still allowed to slip through the cracks. Part 3, Virginia Tech. Sung-Hui Cho moved through campus without leaving an impression. He attended classes, sat quietly, and left without speaking. Few people remembered his voice. Many could not recall his face. He avoided eye contact, kept his head lowered, and positioned himself at the edges of rooms. In lecture halls filled with dozens of students, he blended into the background so completely that his presence barely registered. Silence defined him. In class discussions, he did not participate. When called upon, his responses were brief or non-existent. Some classmates assumed he was shy. Others thought he was simply uninterested. Over time, he became invisible not because he was ignored, but because he actively withdrew from interaction. His isolation was not sudden. It was gradual, persistent, and absolute. His difficulties began long before college. As a child, he struggled with anxiety and communication. He was later diagnosed with selective mutism, a condition that made verbal expression in social settings extremely difficult. Teachers noticed his discomfort and emotional distance. He spent much of his time alone, avoiding attention and conflict. Despite these challenges, he advanced academically and eventually enrolled at Virginia Tech as an English major. University life intensified his isolation rather than easing it. Expectations increased. Social demands multiplied. Cho lived in a dormitory surrounded by peers yet remained alone. Attempts at conversation were met with silence. Invitations were rare, and when they occurred, they were declined. His room became a refuge, a place where he could retreat from a world he did not understand and believed did not understand him. Concerns about his mental health were not absent. They were documented. At one point, he was evaluated by mental health professionals after troubling behavior raised alarms. A court declared him mentally ill and in need of treatment. However, the ruling did not mandate inpatient care. Instead, he was released with instructions to pursue outpatient support. Follow-up was inconsistent. Communication between departments was fragmented. His status remained unclear within the system. In academic settings, warning signs appeared again. Cho submitted writing assignments that disturbed professors and classmates. His work contained themes of anger, resentment, and fixation on violence. Some instructors felt uneasy enough to report their concerns. Meetings were held. Notes were taken. Yet no decisive intervention followed. The material was seen as troubling but protected under creative expression. The threshold for action was not crossed. While concerns circulated quietly, Cho's internal world grew darker. He felt misunderstood, ignored, and humiliated. He interpreted indifference as hostility. Over time, resentment hardened into obsession. He began to view himself as an outsider wronged by society. This narrative became central to his identity. Privately, he prepared. Firearms were purchased through legal channels. Background checks did not flag his mental health history, as his outpatient status did not meet reporting requirements at the time. The process presented no obstacles. He acquired weapons and ammunition without interference. His preparation was deliberate and concealed. In the days leading up to the event, Cho recorded videos and wrote a manifesto. The content expressed contempt for those he believed represented privilege and success. He framed himself as a victim seeking recognition through destruction. The materials were not shared publicly beforehand. They were intended to be seen only after the act. The first phase unfolded early in the morning inside a campus dormitory. 2 students were attacked, signaling the beginning of a sequence that would escalate rapidly. Afterward, Cho returned to his room. Instead of fleeing, he prepared for what he had planned next. He mailed his package of videos and writings to a news organization, ensuring his narrative would be delivered. Hours later, he moved across campus to Norris Hall, an academic building where classes were in session. Once inside, he used chains to block entrances, slowing escape and response. Classrooms filled with confusion as the reality of the situation became clear. Some students barricaded doors with furniture. Others attempted to escape through windows. Faculty members acted instinctively, guiding students, blocking entrances, and buying time. The violence inside Norris Hall was concentrated and relentless. Room by room, Cho moved through the building. Professors placed themselves between danger and their students. Several lost their lives while attempting to protect others. The sounds of chaos echoed through hallways as emergency calls reached authorities. Law enforcement responded and forced entry despite the barriers. Officers advanced toward the source of danger. As they approached, Cho ended his own life. The sequence concluded without arrest, without questioning, and without the opportunity for a trial. When the building was secured, the scale of loss emerged. 32 people had been killed. Many others were injured. The campus was locked down. Students and faculty gathered in shock, waiting for information about friends and classmates. Families across the country searched for names, hoping not to find them on lists of the dead. Media coverage was immediate and overwhelming. Attention focused not only on the individual responsible, but on the system that had failed to intervene earlier. Questions dominated public discussion. How did someone with documented mental health issues legally obtain firearms? Why were warnings noted but not escalated? How did information fall through institutional gaps? Investigations revealed that court records related to Cho's mental health had not been entered into national background check databases. Academic concerns were documented but not unified into a comprehensive response. Responsibility was dispersed across departments, resulting in inaction. No single failure explained the outcome. Instead, a chain of missed opportunities became apparent. Virginia Tech responded with changes. Emergency alert systems were redesigned to deliver immediate notifications. Communication protocols were revised. Counseling services were expanded. Threat assessment teams were formalized to evaluate concerning behavior more aggressively. The campus itself was altered. Memorials were created. Certain spaces were permanently closed or redesigned. The broader impact extended beyond one university. Institutions nationwide reviewed their policies. States reconsidered reporting requirements for mental health adjudications. The case became a reference point in discussions about privacy, prevention, and public safety. Cho left behind no testimony, no cross-examination, and no chance for accountability through the courts. His narrative exists only through the materials he sent and the damage he caused. Survivors and families of victims carried the burden forward, honoring those lost through scholarships, foundations, and annual remembrances. The image that remains is not of a loud threat or obvious danger, but of a person who faded into the background while unraveling internally. A figure present but unseen. A warning recorded but unresolved. The tragedy forced recognition that invisibility does not equal harmlessness, and that silence can conceal risk rather than negate it. Which overlooked warning do you think mattered most in this case? In the next part, the story moves to a high school where two students planned far more than anyone imagined, changing the way an entire country views safety forever. Part 4, Columbine High School. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were not invisible, but they were never central. They moved through the hallways of Columbine High School as outsiders, known but not understood. One carried constant anger, sharp and outward-facing. The other carried a heavy sadness, turned inward and quietly consuming. Together, they formed a closed world built on resentment, alienation, and a growing sense that they had been wronged by everyone around them. Eric projected control. He wrote with confidence, contempt, and certainty. His words reflected superiority and rage. He believed others were inferior, shallow, and deserving of punishment. Teachers and classmates described him as volatile, easily irritated, and intensely focused on his own grievances. Dylan, by contrast, appeared withdrawn and depressed. His journals revealed despair, loneliness, and a desire to disappear. Where Eric wanted to dominate, Dylan wanted escape. Their differences did not cancel each other out. They amplified each other. Over time, their bond deepened through shared frustration. Conversations shifted from complaints to fantasies. They recorded videos together, speaking directly to the camera as if addressing an unseen audience. Their tone alternated between mocking and bitter. They spoke about classmates, society, and the school as symbols of everything they hated. These recordings were not impulsive. They were rehearsed, intentional, and meant to be discovered later. Their journals revealed fixation. Pages filled with violent imagery, revenge narratives, and admiration for previous attackers. They studied past incidents carefully, not to understand tragedy, but to surpass it. The goal was not expression. It was impact. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted scale. They wanted control over how the story would be told. What most people misunderstood for years was the nature of their plan. The shooting was never meant to be the main event. The real objective involved explosives. They constructed homemade devices and acquired materials over months. The cafeteria was selected deliberately. Timers were set to align with the busiest lunch period, when hundreds of students would be gathered in one place. Their intention was mass casualties far beyond anything the school had ever experienced. Firearms were acquired through private means, bypassing safeguards that would have blocked them based on age. Ammunition was stockpiled. Bombs were tested and refined. Everything was documented. The planning phase was meticulous and patient. There was no rush. They chose a date months in advance and counted down to it. On the morning of April 20th, they arrived at school wearing long coats to conceal weapons. They placed the explosive devices in the cafeteria and left the area, expecting detonation to trigger chaos and emergency response. When the bombs failed to explode, the plan collapsed. What followed was not improvisation born of panic, but a fallback they had already considered. They began firing outside the building, targeting students gathered near entrances. Confusion spread rapidly. Emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. The school went into lockdown. Students ran, hid, or froze, unsure where the danger was coming from. Eric and Dylan entered the building and moved toward the library, where many had taken refuge. Inside the library, fear concentrated. Students hid under tables. Some tried to escape through windows. Others remained still, hoping not to be noticed. The attackers moved through the room, speaking at times, silent at others. Their actions were deliberate, not frantic. They showed no intention of surrendering. The violence in that space would later define the memory of the event. By the time it ended, 12 students and 1 teacher had lost their lives. Many others were injured. Outside, law enforcement struggled to understand the scope of the situation. Reports were fragmented. Explosive devices discovered around the campus created uncertainty and delayed entry. Teachers and students remained trapped in classrooms for hours, unsure if the attackers were still moving through the building. Eventually, Eric and Dylan returned to the library. With the larger plan failed and police surrounding the school, they turned their weapons on themselves. There was no arrest. No interrogation. No opportunity to challenge their narrative. What remained were questions, grief, and a trail of documentation they left behind intentionally. The investigation that followed uncovered the full extent of their preparation. Homes were searched. Computers were analyzed. Videos and journals were released to the public. The image of 2 bullied teenagers seeking revenge proved too simple. What emerged instead was a portrait of prolonged planning, ideological fixation, and a desire for notoriety that went far beyond personal grievance. Public reaction reshaped the national conversation. Schools across the country re-examined security protocols. Lockdown drills became standard. The presence of school resource officers increased. Discussions about bullying expanded, but so did awareness that violence could not be explained by bullying alone. The event exposed gaps in threat assessment, communication, and early intervention. Columbine became a reference point. Every subsequent incident was compared to it. Training manuals cited it. Media narratives returned to it. The name carried weight, signaling a turning point in how educational spaces were perceived. Schools were no longer assumed to be inherently safe. Preparedness replaced assumption. For survivors and families of victims, the legacy was deeply personal. Memorials were created. Foundations were established. Stories were told and retold, not to preserve the attackers' names, but to honor those who did not come home. Over time, the focus shifted away from the perpetrators toward prevention, support, and remembrance. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold left behind no testimony, only artifacts of intent. Their plan failed in part, but the damage endured. The fear they introduced did not fade quickly. It reshaped architecture, policy, and perception. Columbine marked the moment when America realized that school violence could be planned quietly, patiently, and with catastrophic intent. Which part of this planning do you believe most clearly shows how preventable this tragedy might have been? In the next part, the story moves to a former student who returned to his school alone, carrying every warning sign that had already been written down. Part 5, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Nicholas Cruz was not a stranger to concern. From early childhood, his behavior drew attention. He was adopted as an infant and grew up in a household that struggled to manage his emotional volatility. Outbursts were frequent. Impulsivity followed him through elementary and middle school. Teachers documented aggression, fixation on weapons, and difficulty regulating anger. These were not isolated moments. They formed a pattern that accumulated year after year. As he moved into adolescence, the warnings became clearer. He was involved in fights. He made disturbing comments. He posted troubling messages online. School administrators disciplined him repeatedly. Records grew thicker. Meetings were held. Reports were written. Eventually, the school removed him and placed him in an alternative educational program. The decision was meant to protect others, but it also removed daily oversight and structure. He drifted further from routine and accountability. Home life offered little stability. His adoptive father had died earlier, leaving his mother as the sole caregiver. She struggled with his behavior and health issues of her own. Arguments were common. Police were called to the home multiple times due to disputes and concerns about his conduct. Each encounter ended without long-term intervention. He remained free, untreated, and increasingly isolated. When his mother died suddenly, whatever fragile structure remained collapsed. He moved between households, staying with family, friends, and acquaintances under conditions that often broke down. Those around him noticed his obsession with firearms and violent imagery. Some expressed concern openly. Others felt uneasy but unsure how to respond. Several reports were made to authorities regarding alarming statements and online posts. None resulted in decisive action. Despite the extensive record of warnings, there were no legal barriers preventing him from purchasing a firearm once he reached adulthood. Background checks revealed no disqualifying convictions. Mental health concerns, though documented informally, did not meet reporting thresholds. He legally obtained a rifle and ammunition. The act itself raised alarms among people who knew his history, but concern did not translate into prevention. On the afternoon of February 14, he traveled to his former school using a ride service. He carried his weapon in a case that drew little attention. It was late afternoon, close to dismissal. Students were moving through hallways and stairwells. Teachers were preparing to end the day. The environment was routine, predictable, and unguarded. Inside the building, confusion spread quickly. Fire alarms sounded. Students assumed it was a drill or malfunction. As they exited classrooms, the reality became clear. Panic followed. Some ran. Some hid. Some froze. Teachers attempted to guide students to safety, locking doors and turning off lights where possible. Emergency calls began immediately. Law enforcement received multiple reports within minutes. Officers arrived on campus quickly but faced uncertainty about the exact location of the threat. The attacker moved through the building, then discarded his weapon and blended in with fleeing students. He left the campus on foot, walking through nearby streets without resistance. The absence of immediate identification allowed him to escape the area. In the aftermath, first responders treated the injured while families waited for news. 17 people had lost their lives, including students and staff. The scale of loss shocked the nation, not only because of the numbers, but because so many warning signs had existed beforehand. This was not a case of an unknown figure emerging suddenly. His history had been documented repeatedly. Authorities launched an intensive search. Within hours, Nicholas Cruz was located at a nearby location and taken into custody without incident. He made no attempt to flee further. He did not resist arrest. During questioning, he admitted responsibility. Investigators recovered digital records, messages, and videos that confirmed his fixation on previous attacks and desire for notoriety. The legal process unfolded over several years. Prosecutors sought the most severe punishment available, citing the number of victims and the deliberate nature of the act. The defense focused on his upbringing, neurological issues, and long history of emotional disturbance. Court proceedings were marked by emotional testimony from survivors, educators, and families who had lost children. The trial forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions. How could someone with such a documented history still obtain weapons? Why were repeated warnings fragmented across agencies rather than unified into action? What responsibility did institutions bear when warning signs were recognized but not escalated? In the end, the jury did not reach unanimous agreement on the harshest sentence. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of release. The decision divided families. Some expressed anger and disappointment. Others believed permanent confinement was sufficient. No outcome could restore what was lost. Beyond the courtroom, the impact extended far wider. Students who survived refused to remain silent. They organized, spoke publicly, and confronted lawmakers. Their voices carried weight because they spoke from lived experience. Marches followed. Legislative sessions reopened debates that had stalled for years. In Florida, new laws were passed allowing temporary removal of firearms from individuals deemed a threat. Funding for school security and mental health services increased. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School itself changed. Counseling services expanded. Security measures were redesigned. The building where the event occurred was scheduled for removal, its presence too painful to remain. Memorials were created to honor those who were lost, ensuring their names would not be overshadowed by the one who caused the harm. The story of Nicholas Cruz is often described as a failure of systems rather than a mystery of motive. The signs were visible. The records existed. The warnings were spoken. Yet they remained scattered, diluted by procedure, and ultimately ineffective. His path demonstrates how danger can persist in plain sight when responsibility is divided and urgency fades. For many, this event marked a shift. It reframed debates about prevention, accountability, and the role of institutions in acting on known risk. It highlighted the limits of reactive measures and the cost of delay. The voices that rose afterward ensured the conversation did not end with sentencing. Which warning sign do you believe should have triggered intervention sooner? In the next part, the focus moves away from schools and into a crowded public space where no one expected danger to arrive with a movie ticket. Part 6, Century 16 Theater. James Holmes was once defined by promise. He excelled academically, earning strong grades and praise for discipline and focus. Friends and instructors described him as intelligent, quiet, and socially awkward but capable. He pursued neuroscience with the ambition of understanding how the human mind works. Acceptance into a competitive doctoral program reinforced the image of a future built on intellect and research. That structure began to collapse under pressure. Graduate study demanded collaboration, sustained performance, and emotional resilience. Holmes withdrew further as expectations increased. He stopped participating in group work. Deadlines slipped. An important evaluation ended poorly. The academic identity he relied on fractured, and with it his sense of purpose. He left the program, not with clarity, but with growing internal turmoil. Mental health care entered the picture before the event. Holmes sought treatment through university services. Sessions focused on anxiety, intrusive thoughts, and a sense of detachment from reality. At one point, he spoke about violent fantasies in abstract terms. Concerns were shared within the institution, but no immediate action followed. He had not made a specific threat. He was leaving the program. The assessment concluded without escalation. As academic life unraveled, preparation quietly replaced routine. Holmes acquired firearms and large quantities of ammunition through lawful means. The purchases did not trigger intervention. He also obtained protective gear and equipment that suggested planning beyond hobby or sport. Packages arrived at his apartment. Neighbors noticed deliveries but had no context to interpret them as danger. Inside the apartment, another layer formed. He constructed devices intended to cause harm to anyone entering unprepared. The setup was complex and concealed, designed to delay discovery and increase risk. This preparation was not impulsive. It reflected methodical planning and anticipation of response. Before leaving for the event, Holmes mailed a notebook to a former psychiatrist. The content contained disorganized thoughts and violent ideas. It arrived too late to matter. It would not be opened until after everything had already happened. The setting he chose was ordinary. A midnight movie premiere. Crowds gathering for entertainment. Familiar routines. He purchased a ticket, entered the auditorium, and took a seat among others. After a short time, he exited through a side door, propping it open. He returned wearing protective gear and carrying weapons. Confusion followed as devices were deployed to create disorientation. Inside the theater, panic spread quickly. People attempted to flee, hide, or help others. Emergency calls flooded dispatchers. Law enforcement arrived within minutes, encountering injured patrons outside and chaos within. Holmes was found near his vehicle, compliant and silent. He identified himself and offered no resistance. He warned officers about hazards in his apartment, prompting an extensive response to secure the area. The immediate toll was devastating. Lives were lost. Many more were injured physically and psychologically. First responders established triage areas and transported victims using every available means. News spread nationwide by morning. Names and stories emerged as families searched for loved ones. Holmes was taken into custody and charged with numerous counts related to the event. His legal team pursued an insanity defense, arguing that severe mental illness impaired his ability to understand or control his actions. Prosecutors emphasized preparation, timing, and steps taken to avoid interruption as evidence of intent and awareness. The trial was lengthy and emotionally intense. Expert testimony focused on psychiatric evaluations and legal standards. Court-appointed specialists concluded that Holmes was mentally ill but did not meet the threshold required to avoid responsibility. The distinction mattered. It shaped the outcome. Victims and families spoke in court about loss, injury, and enduring trauma. Their statements grounded the proceedings in lived experience rather than abstract debate. The defense described a long decline, missed opportunities for intervention, and a system that failed to contain a person in crisis. The prosecution detailed planning, equipment, and the deliberate nature of the act. The verdict found Holmes guilty on all charges. During the sentencing phase, the most severe penalty was sought but required unanimous agreement. That consensus was not reached. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of release. Reactions were mixed. Some felt the sentence was just. Others believed it fell short. No decision could repair the damage. After sentencing, Holmes was transferred to a high-security facility. He would spend the rest of his life confined. The focus shifted again to prevention. How mental health disclosures are handled. How institutions respond to concerning behavior. How access to weapons intersects with treatment and reporting. The theater reopened after renovation, but the auditorium where the event occurred was permanently closed and redesigned. Memorials honored those who died. Scholarships and foundations emerged in their names. Survivors faced long recoveries, surgeries, and ongoing emotional consequences that extended far beyond headlines. The case left unanswered questions. Holmes never offered a clear explanation. Analysts pointed to a convergence of factors rather than a single cause. Isolation. Academic failure. Untreated illness. Access. Planning. Each alone insufficient, together catastrophic. Public spaces reevaluated security. Universities revisited threat assessment protocols. Mental health reporting standards became part of broader policy discussions. The legacy was not only fear, but scrutiny of systems meant to identify risk before harm occurs. The enduring lesson was not about spectacle, but about fragility. A person with intellectual promise can unravel without adequate support. Warning signs can be documented without decisive action. Ordinary places can become sites of irreversible loss when preparation goes unnoticed. Which point along this path do you think presented the clearest chance to intervene? In the next part, the story moves to an elementary school playground where hatred and grievance were directed at the youngest victims imaginable. Part 7, Cleveland Elementary School. Patrick Purdy carried resentment long before he carried a weapon. His childhood was unstable, shaped by frequent moves, neglect, and an abusive environment. He drifted between relatives, foster homes, and temporary arrangements without ever developing a sense of belonging. School did not provide refuge. He struggled academically, dropped out early, and moved into adulthood without direction, stability, or support. As years passed, his life narrowed. Employment was inconsistent. Substance abuse became a pattern. Minor arrests accumulated, none serious enough to trigger long-term supervision. Each encounter with authorities ended the same way, with release and no sustained follow-up. To people who crossed his path, he appeared angry, restless, and bitter, but not urgent enough to stop. Over time, his frustration hardened into ideology. He began blaming immigrants and minorities for his failures. This belief did not emerge suddenly. It grew slowly through isolation, misinformation, and repeated reinforcement of grievance. He fixated on the idea that opportunities had been taken from him by people who did not belong. Hatred gave shape to his sense of loss. It offered a target for his anger when no personal success followed. In the months leading up to the event, his behavior grew more erratic. He muttered to himself. He appeared increasingly detached from reality. Yet the systems around him did not respond. Firearms were obtained through lawful means. At the time, background checks were limited and fragmented. Prior arrests and mental instability did not automatically block access. What should have been barriers were instead open doors. On a clear January morning, Patrick Purdy drove to Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California. The school served a large population of children from Southeast Asian refugee families. Many of these children came from households that had already experienced displacement and trauma before arriving in the United States. For them, the playground represented safety, routine, and normal childhood. Purdy parked near the campus and created a diversion, then walked toward the playground carrying a weapon and additional supplies. Children were outside, laughing, talking, and playing. Teachers were supervising as they had done countless times before. Nothing suggested danger. There was no warning. No announcement. No chance to prepare. What followed unfolded rapidly. Panic spread across the playground. Teachers reacted instinctively, pulling children toward classrooms, shielding them with their bodies, and locking doors where possible. Emergency calls flooded local authorities. The chaos lasted only minutes, but the impact would last generations. When the scene fell silent, the scale of harm became clear. Young lives had been lost. Many others were injured, both physically and emotionally. Families rushed to the school, desperate for information. Parents searched for their children among ambulances and emergency responders. For some, relief came. For others, it did not. Patrick Purdy did not survive the event. There would be no trial, no testimony, and no opportunity to confront him with the consequences of his actions. Investigators were left to piece together his motives through writings and belongings recovered from his vehicle and living space. What they found confirmed a worldview driven by racial hatred and blame. Documents revealed racist language and fixation on immigrant communities. There was no personal connection to the victims. The children targeted were strangers. The choice of location was deliberate. The attack was intended to strike at a symbol of diversity and innocence, amplifying its cruelty. The national response was immediate and intense. Images of a school playground turned into a scene of trauma shocked the public. The idea that elementary students could be targeted because of their background forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about hate and access to weapons. In California, lawmakers acted quickly. The event became a catalyst for changes to firearm regulations. Restrictions on certain weapons were introduced. Limits on magazine capacity were enacted. The state moved to strengthen oversight and reduce access in ways that had not previously gained enough political momentum. Cleveland Elementary became a reference point in legislative debates. Beyond laws, the psychological impact rippled outward. The school community struggled to recover. Counseling services were provided to students, teachers, and families. Many children carried lasting fear into adulthood. The playground, once a place of joy, required physical renovation and symbolic transformation. Memorials were built to honor those who were lost, ensuring they would be remembered for their lives, not the hatred that ended them. Nationally, the event reshaped conversations about bias-motivated harm. It demonstrated that violence driven by ideology does not require organized groups or elaborate networks. A single individual, fueled by grievance and enabled by access, could devastate a community in moments. The tragedy also exposed limitations in how society identifies risk. Patrick Purdy had a documented history of instability, arrests, and substance abuse. He was known to express anger and resentment openly. Yet there was no mechanism to connect these factors into preventive action. Each warning existed in isolation, never forming a picture urgent enough to prompt intervention. Cleveland Elementary was not the most deadly event of its kind, but it was among the most jarring. The age of the victim stripped away any remaining illusion that violence followed logic or fairness. It forced recognition that innocence offers no protection when hatred goes unchecked. In the years that followed, the Stockton attack was cited repeatedly in discussions about school safety, hate-driven violence, and firearm access. It influenced training, legislation, and public awareness. Even as later events captured headlines, this one remained a turning point for California and a warning for the nation. Patrick Purdy left behind no justification that could explain the harm he caused. His actions were rooted in resentment, isolation, and a belief system built on exclusion. The children he targeted represented nothing more than vulnerability. That reality remains the most disturbing element of the story. The legacy of Cleveland Elementary is not defined by the individual who caused harm, but by the changes it forced. Laws were rewritten. Awareness expanded. Communities learned that hate does not always announce itself loudly before it acts. Which aspect of this case do you believe exposed the greatest failure in preventing harm? In the next part, the story turns to two boys barely into adolescence, whose age made their plan almost impossible for anyone to imagine. Part 8, Westside Middle School. Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson were children by age, but their thinking did not resemble childhood. One was quiet, observant, and unusually comfortable around firearms. The other was older, angry, and openly defiant. Together, they formed a partnership built on resentment, curiosity about violence, and a desire to be noticed. Adults around them saw warning signs, but age softened the response. Few believed children this young could plan something real. Mitchell showed signs of trouble early. He argued with authority figures, made threats, and spoke about wanting to harm others. Some classmates heard his words and dismissed them as exaggeration. Teachers noted behavioral issues but treated them as discipline problems rather than indicators of danger. Andrew, younger and less outspoken, attracted less scrutiny. He grew up in a household where guns were common. He learned how to handle them calmly and confidently, without fear or hesitation. Their bond developed through shared frustration. They spoke about being wronged, ignored, and disrespected. Conversations escalated from complaints to ideas. Those ideas turned into plans. They did not act impulsively. They observed routines. They discussed outcomes. They prepared supplies beyond what would be needed for a single moment, suggesting thoughts about escape and survival afterward. Weapons were taken from family property without resistance. Rifles, handguns, and ammunition were removed quietly. Camping gear and food were gathered. The planning showed patience and understanding of logistics that few expected from children. Friends later recalled comments hinting that something big was coming. The statements were brushed aside. Age created disbelief. On the morning of the event, the boys arrived at Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas. The environment was ordinary. Classes were underway. Teachers followed routine. Andrew entered the building alone and pulled the fire alarm. The sound triggered automatic response. Students and staff exited classrooms in lines, following procedures practiced during drills. The alarm worked exactly as intended. Outside, Mitchell waited in a wooded area overlooking the school grounds. From that position, they had a clear view of the evacuation path. As students and teachers gathered outside, confused but compliant, the plan moved forward. The strategy was simple and devastating. The alarm drew people into the open. The vantage point provided distance and cover. Panic erupted when danger became clear. Children ran in every direction. Teachers attempted to shield students and guide them back towards safety. The open space offered little protection. Emergency calls were placed immediately. The entire sequence lasted only minutes, but for those caught in it, time distorted into terror and confusion. When law enforcement arrived, the danger had already ended. The boys dropped their weapons and attempted to flee on foot. They were captured nearby without resistance. Officers were stunned by their ages. The image of children in custody for such an act unsettled even experienced responders. 5 people lost their lives, including students and a teacher. Others were injured physically and emotionally. Families rushed to hospitals and reunification centers, desperate for information. The town struggled to reconcile the reality of what had happened with the faces of the children responsible. The legal system faced immediate limits. At the time, state law did not allow children of their ages to be tried as adults for such acts. They were charged as juveniles. The maximum confinement available extended only until early adulthood. For many families, this reality felt unbearable. The severity of harm and the brevity of potential punishment seemed impossible to reconcile. Court proceedings focused on accountability within the boundaries of juvenile law. The boys were found responsible and placed in separate detention facilities. Their records were sealed, as required. Public outrage followed. Debates erupted nationwide about whether laws adequately addressed extreme acts committed by minors. Some argued for reform. Others warned against abandoning principles designed to protect children from lifelong punishment. As release dates approached years later, fear resurfaced. Communities questioned what supervision would exist once confinement ended. In the years that followed, concerns proved justified in at least one case, as later legal trouble emerged. The idea that such violence could be temporary in consequence unsettled many. The impact on school safety was immediate and lasting. Fire alarm procedures were re-evaluated. Evacuation protocols were rewritten. Schools began questioning assumptions about drills and compliance. The realization that safety systems could be exploited forced a rethinking of emergency design nationwide. The event also reshaped conversations about access to firearms in homes with children. The ease with which weapons were obtained became central to prevention efforts. Families were urged to secure firearms more rigorously. Awareness campaigns expanded, emphasizing that familiarity does not equal safety. For survivors, the effects endured. Many carried anxiety, nightmares, and a loss of trust in routine signals meant to protect them. Memorials were built. Names were spoken regularly. The community worked to heal while knowing that the story would never fully fade. Westside Middle School became one of the earliest examples of youth-led mass harm in the United States. It challenged assumptions about age, intent, and capability. It demonstrated that planning does not require adulthood, and that disbelief can become a vulnerability. The most unsettling aspect was not only what the boys did, but how effectively they used systems designed for safety. The fire alarm was not broken. Procedures were not ignored. Everything worked as designed. That truth forced a deeper question about how protection must evolve. Which part of this plan do you think adults should have taken seriously sooner? In the next part, the story shifts to a crowded nightclub where celebration turned into tragedy within moments, under flashing lights and loud music. Part 9, Pulse Nightclub. Omar Mateen carried anger long before he carried a weapon. His childhood was marked by volatility, discipline problems, and frequent conflict. Teachers recalled aggressive behavior and sudden outbursts. Classmates described him as easily provoked and hostile. As he grew older, these traits did not fade. They hardened into a personality defined by resentment and instability. Adult life brought little balance. He worked as a security guard, a role that provided authority without offering respect. Complaints followed him from job to job. Co-workers reported erratic behavior, prejudice, and an obsession with power. Personal relationships were turbulent. His first marriage ended quickly, with later claims of controlling and abusive conduct. The second appeared quieter on the surface, but distance replaced closeness. Those closest to him sensed tension but lacked clarity on its depth. Over time, his worldview shifted. He consumed extremist rhetoric online and expressed admiration for acts of terror abroad. His statements were inconsistent, borrowing language from different ideologies without coherence. What remained consistent was the desire for recognition. He wanted significance. He wanted to be seen as someone who mattered. Federal authorities became aware of him more than once. Interviews were conducted after concerning remarks and potential connections to individuals under investigation. Each inquiry ended the same way. No direct threat. No actionable plan. No grounds to proceed. The files were closed. He returned to ordinary life with renewed confidence that he remained invisible to consequence. Access followed. Firearms were obtained legally. Background checks revealed no disqualifying record. The process treated him as any other buyer. In the weeks before the event, he visited Pulse nightclub multiple times. The venue was known as a gathering place for the LGBTQ community, especially during themed nights. Whether he was observing or simply familiarizing himself, the visits went unnoticed. The night he chose was crowded and loud. Music filled the space. People danced, talked, and celebrated without caution. He entered shortly after closing time, blending into the remaining crowd. Within moments, panic replaced music. Confusion spread as people tried to understand what was happening. Many initially believed it was part of the environment. That illusion vanished quickly. As law enforcement arrived, the situation shifted into a prolonged standoff. Mateen retreated to a confined area where people had taken shelter. He communicated with authorities, alternating between threats and ideological declarations. The statements lacked consistency. Investigators later concluded that his claims were self-constructed rather than part of an organized effort. The core motivation appeared personal rather than coordinated. Hours passed. Inside, survivors waited in silence and fear. Some contacted loved ones. Others reached emergency services again and again, pleading for help. Outside, negotiators worked to gather information and prevent further loss. The building remained sealed as decisions were weighed. Time stretched under pressure. Eventually, officers determined that immediate action was necessary. A tactical team breached the structure using force to create access. The confrontation ended shortly afterward. When the building was secured, the scale of devastation became clear. 49 people had lost their lives. Many others were injured. The number surpassed any previous mass casualty event of its kind in the country at that time. Morning light revealed the aftermath. Families searched hospitals and emergency centers. Names were released slowly. Vigils formed almost immediately, not only in Orlando but across the nation. The site became a place of mourning, layered with flowers, candles, and messages of solidarity. Investigators searched Mateen's home and digital devices. They found no evidence of accomplices or foreign direction. The narrative that emerged centered on grievance, instability, and fixation on notoriety. The complexity of his ideological claims collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was an individual driven by hatred and a need for attention. Legal proceedings shifted focus. Because Mateen did not survive, there would be no trial. Attention turned to others. His spouse faced charges related to knowledge and assistance. After extensive proceedings, she was cleared when prosecutors failed to prove intent or awareness. The outcome reinforced the difficulty of assigning responsibility beyond the individual. The broader impact was immediate. Questions resurfaced about how someone investigated by federal authorities could still obtain weapons. Debates about hate-driven violence intensified. Emergency response tactics were re-examined, particularly those involving prolonged standoffs in crowded venues. Pulse nightclub itself became a symbol. Plans were made to preserve parts of the site as a memorial. Annual remembrances honored the victims by name. Murals and public art spread throughout the city, transforming grief into collective memory. Survivors carried physical and emotional scars that extended far beyond that night. Policy discussions followed familiar lines but with renewed urgency. Firearm access. Domestic extremism. Support for targeted communities. Training for first responders. Each topic returned to the same core question. How many warning signs can exist before they form a picture clear enough to act upon? Mateen's case demonstrated the limits of reactive systems. Investigations occurred. Interviews were conducted. Files were closed. Each step followed procedure, yet the outcome remained catastrophic. The absence of a single decisive failure made accountability diffuse and frustration widespread. For many, the most painful realization was that the attack targeted a space defined by acceptance and celebration. The violence struck not only individuals but a community that already faced vulnerability. That reality amplified the sense of loss and injustice. The legacy of Pulse is carried in names, anniversaries, and ongoing advocacy. It remains a reference point in discussions about prevention and preparedness. It stands as evidence that hatred does not require coherence to be lethal, only opportunity. Which moment in this sequence do you believe should have changed the outcome? In the next part, the story moves to a small university where unresolved resentment followed a former student back into the classroom. Part 10, Oikos University. One-Go arrived in the United States carrying expectations that never found footing. Born in South Korea, he immigrated as an adult and struggled to adapt to a new language, culture, and professional environment. Jobs came and went. Stability never stayed. Friends and relatives described him as quiet, withdrawn, and easily frustrated when he felt misunderstood or dismissed. His sense of worth became fragile, easily shaken by perceived slights. At one point, he enlisted in the military, hoping structure would provide direction. The experience ended early with an administrative discharge. The separation reinforced a growing belief that institutions rejected him. Instead of recalibrating, he internalized failure as humiliation inflicted by others. Over time, that belief hardened. Seeking a reset, he enrolled at Oikos University, a small Christian vocational college in Oakland that attracted many immigrant students pursuing practical careers. He chose a nursing program, believing it would offer a clear path forward. From the beginning, challenges emerged. Language barriers made coursework difficult. Classroom interactions felt tense. He interpreted feedback as mockery. Disagreements with instructors escalated quickly. Classmates later recalled awkward moments and visible frustration. Instructors noticed anger and paranoia, but nothing crossed a line that demanded immediate removal. Eventually, academic difficulties and conflict led to his withdrawal from the program. For One-Go, leaving was not simply an end. It became proof. He believed he had been disrespected, cheated, and publicly humiliated. After leaving the school, his life narrowed further. Financial strain increased. Social contact diminished. He fixated on the idea that the institution owed him money and recognition. Each unanswered grievance reinforced his narrative. He replayed interactions repeatedly, reframing them as deliberate insults. The resentment did not fade. It fermented. During this period, he acquired a firearm through legal channels. There were no restrictions preventing the purchase. His background revealed no disqualifying record. To the system, he appeared ordinary. Internally, his anger had become consuming. On the morning of the event, One-Go returned to the campus he believed had wronged him. The school day had begun normally. Students attended classes. Staff worked at desks. The environment was quiet, predictable, and unguarded. He entered the building and confronted a receptionist, attempting to direct people into a classroom. When compliance did not follow, the situation escalated immediately. Inside classrooms, panic spread. Students tried to hide under desks or flee through doors and windows. The building filled with confusion and fear. Emergency calls reached authorities within minutes. The sequence unfolded rapidly, leaving little time for response. When it ended, 7 people had lost their lives and others were injured. Many of the victims were immigrants themselves, pursuing education in hopes of better futures. The irony was unavoidable. Individuals seeking stability became casualties of someone who believed stability had been denied to him. Unlike many cases before it, this one did not end on sight. One-Go left the building and fled in a vehicle taken from a former classmate. Law enforcement launched a search. About an hour later, he surrendered at a grocery store in a nearby city. He approached employees calmly and stated that he had harmed people and needed police. Arrest followed without resistance. In custody, he spoke openly about his grievances. He described feeling mocked for his accent and intelligence. He claimed financial injustice. Investigators reviewed his statements and history. Former classmates confirmed tensions but expressed disbelief that they could lead to such harm. Many of his perceived slights appeared exaggerated or unfounded, but to him they were absolute truths. The legal process was complicated by questions of mental competence. Evaluations indicated symptoms consistent with severe mental illness, including paranoia and disorganized thinking. Proceedings were delayed as courts determined whether he understood the charges against him. He was sent to a state hospital for treatment. Time passed. Eventually, doctors concluded he was competent to proceed. Rather than face a full trial, One-Go entered a plea agreement. He accepted responsibility without contest. The court sentenced him to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of release, with additional years for injuries caused. The sentence ensured he would never re-enter society. Families of the victims spoke in court, describing lives cut short and futures erased. Reactions were complex. Some expressed relief that the process was over and that he would never be free. Others felt no sentence could reflect the scale of loss. The university itself never recovered fully. Enrollment declined. Programs closed. The building where the event occurred was eventually shut down. Memorials and plaques marked the space, ensuring the victims would be remembered. The broader implications reached beyond one campus. The case highlighted vulnerabilities at small educational institutions with limited security and resources. It raised questions about how grievances are addressed, how warning signs are interpreted, and how easily resentment can become obsession when left unchallenged. One-Go did not act impulsively in a moment of rage. His actions followed years of perceived humiliation and isolation. The danger lay not in sudden collapse, but in slow accumulation. A belief repeated often enough became reality in his mind. No system intervened effectively before it was too late. The story forces an uncomfortable conclusion. Violence does not always emerge from chaos. Sometimes it grows quietly inside people who feel unseen, unheard, and wronged. When those beliefs are reinforced by isolation and access, the outcome can be devastating. Oiko's University stands as a reminder that resentment can outlast opportunity, and that unresolved grievance can transform ordinary spaces into sites of irreversible loss. The victims are remembered not for how they died, but for the lives they were building when they were interrupted. Which moment in this story do you believe could have redirected this outcome? This series may end here, but the questions it raises continue beyond this final chapter, echoing through every place where warning signs are seen but not yet acted upon.